session of this wonderful conference, and I think I can speak for all of us here, and perhaps even for those not yet here, that, well, I certainly hope that this kind of conference is something which we will be able to continue to have in the following years, and perhaps even longer. Fortunately, we still have a number of very interesting sessions today, quite a few in fact, and this is the first of them. During the last few days, I've talked with all three speakers in this particular panel, and well, the titles of their talks are quite intriguing, and if they have one thing in common, it's probably that they are all about heat-related objects, artifacts, things you can actually touch. I'm not quite sure if I'm entirely right. We're about to find out in a few minutes when Maarten Van Gageldonk will be speaking. I'll first introduce Maarten. He is working on a PhD project on the American publisher Roosevelt Press and on their literary cultural magazine Evergreen review, which most of us will be familiar with. He's working at the Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands, where he also teaches a first-year course in American Studies. He's also the editor for the Dutch academic journal Tijdschrift voor Tijdschriftstudies, which translates into periodical for periodical studies. The Dutch abbreviation is TTS. I'm a little hesitant to pronounce what would probably be the English abbreviation for TTS. I guess. Okay.
We've never thought about that.
Okay. He also published on the American multimedia magazine Aspen, and well, from what I've just told you, it's obvious that his interests lie in the 1950s and 1960s culture, periodicals, and film. So, Maarten, it's all yours. I'm going to sit over there because all three speakers are going to show things which we can look at.
Okay. Good morning. It is indeed kind of sad. It was kind of nice to be opening the last day, but it's kind of sad that it's the last day because I've been having great fun here too. So thank you for having me for this talk. So I want to talk a little bit about Evergreen Review and the Beat Generation. Like Jaap said, it's part of a bigger project in which I study mostly actually European literature in Evergreen Review and as published by Grove Press. So normally I wouldn't look at the Beat Generation. I'm not a Beat scholar as such, as some of you are. But I thought that for this conference it was just too nice an opportunity to actually take a look at this fascinating part of the Grove Press and Evergreen Review did. I'll try to stick to 15 to 17, 18 minutes. So I would very much like to begin with an anecdote, if I may. On November 28, 1957, Barney Rossett, the owner of Grove Press and publisher of a new literary magazine, Evergreen Review, received this letter from the director of the Parisian bookstore Brentano's, which is one of the larger English bookstores in Paris at the time. And in the letter, the director complained, and I quote, about the conduct of 3 individuals who called on me today to introduce a magazine published by you, the Evergreen Review. The letter continued, and I will enlarge a part of it so it's easier for you to read along. This is what the director said. The method of introducing the magazine was, to say the least of it, very strange. Several cartons of it were carried into our store. A copy of the magazine was waved at me, and I was frequently informed that Brentano's, as an American firm, were expected to take some of them. After due consideration, I told the trio that I could not take the magazine, upon which they became very loud and abusive, creating a scandal in the store. We, as a firm, were accused of being un-American and of kicking American literature out of the store. Snide remarks were made about the magazines we were presently stocking, etc., etc. The noise and the upset to our business got to a point where I had to ask these people to leave or be forcibly ejected. As some of you might guess, the 3 individuals, none of whom were actually very clean, the bookseller could not help but remark, were Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, and Gregory Corso. As Rossett explained by return letter, he had sent them these magazines, and I quote, so that they might make a few francs and thus be able to buy a decent meal. The issue of Evergreen Review that they were trying to sell was only the second of all, which was to become a key literary magazine of the 1960s. But this particular issue would be its most enduring legacy. Boldly titled The San Francisco Scene on its cover, Evergreen #2 was probably the first nationwide magazine to pay significant attention to the Beat generation, and certainly one of the first to make their poetry available to a wider audience. There's some prose in that issue too, by the way. The issue was edited by Donald Allen, I guess who most of you will be familiar, who was Grove's first editor. And the issue contained work by Ginsberg, but also by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Michael McClure, Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac, and many others. The incident at Brentano's, humorous as it obviously is, also reveals a field of tension, and I would like to explore that a little bit more in my talk today. In the late 1950s, Grove Press would build close relations with many of the Beat writers and repeatedly printed their work in Evergreen Review, as well as publishing books by Jack Kerouac, Subterraneans, for instance, Michael McClure, Robert Duncan, and others. But while the Beats, I think we can easily say this, were a resolutely anti-capitalist, anti-materialist movement, Grove rapidly actually grew into one of the largest left-wing publishers in the United States. And actually, from the very start, Grove had been a well-funded business. All the more since Barney Rossett was able to tap into his extensive family capital to actually support the firm. Thus, when it launched the first issue of Evergreen Review in 1957, it was already published in an edition of 10,000 copies, which is a lot for a literary magazine, obviously. This was certainly not the typical literary magazine, little magazine, that the Beats had customarily associated themselves with before. Move to the next slide, tell you what I want to do today. What I would like to do is I would like to briefly examine this complicated relationship between an avowedly anti-commercial movement and a obviously commercial magazine. For those of you not familiar with Grove Press and Evergreen, I will give a very brief introduction. I won't take too much time on that. To both publisher and magazine, take a little bit of a closer look at the San Francisco Scene issue, and then take a brief look at what Grove and Evergreen did with the Beat generation after the San Francisco Scene. I will also present some observations on the changing connection Grove had with the Beats at the end of the 1950s, which differs very strongly from author to author. And at the end of my talk, I will draw some preliminary conclusions, but mostly to stress that a lot more research in this area might be needed. A very brief introduction to Grove Press. As I suppose that most of you will have some familiarity with Grove Press, I will limit my introduction to the publisher to a very few brief remarks. Grove was one of the many publishing startups in the 1950s, and actually only had 3 titles to its name. You need pretty good eyes to be able to read that. And it was facing bankruptcy when it was acquired by Barney Rossett in 1951. If you can read the list of titles, you will be able to notice that in its early years, Grove mostly published out-of-print classics, obviously because there were no rights involved, so it was cheap. But pretty soon, actually, it began to take on European avant-garde authors as well. Samuel Beckett is a good example. It published Waiting for Godot in 1954, which is obviously a major move, became one of his major selling points in the 1960s. So in many ways, the company also simply appeared at a fortuitous moment for the Beats. 1951 was the year Gregory Corso and Allen Ginsberg first met in New York. 1951 was the year when Kerouac wrote the first draft of On the Road. So there's a sort of logic that this connection would be made. So when Rossett decided to publish a literary magazine in 1956, named after Grove's Evergreen Book Club, the Beats were a logical choice. That the Beats were also part of Rossett's plans for the magazine from the very start is also substantiated by a 2-page document with ideas for the magazine, which dates back to September 1956. The document already contains the suggestion that an excerpt from Kerouac's novel The Subterraneans be included, as well as poetry by James Broughton and Frank O'Hara. I think it's important to stress the cultural context in which Evergreen Review appeared. When the first issue came out in early 1957, American literary magazines were still very much dominated by the new critics, whose frequent double role as both literary critics and poets had led to an academification of American literature. And Rossett clearly intended Evergreen as an alternative to the dominating university-based magazines. There are some examples here: the Kenyon Review, the Antwerp Review, the Hudson Review, etc. On the one hand, he did want to associate himself with them a bit, obviously calling it Evergreen Review. That's why he used the word. As Dudley Fitz, a former editor of 1930s magazines like Criterion and The Hound and Horn, remarked in a New York Times article at the time, tellingly titled "Mark the New Solemnity." I would enlarge a bit of that. He said, 25 years ago, only a self-professed corpse could have achieved the tone of lugubrious semi-literacy that I find in so many of the literary and philosophical essays here. We had our own walking dead, of course, but they were not so much honored as they seem today. So he also observed sort of stalemate in his magazines. So Evergreen was meant to stir up some new blood. It was inspired by magazines like Charles Henry Ford's View, also the Parisian magazine, which is English language, Merlin, and Ross had aimed for a progressive periodical from the start, which tended, and quoting Nicholas Brooke here, to cautious mainstream experimentation. It's a very tentative way of putting this. And from the very start, the magazine embraced a new avant-garde, both American and European. For instance, printing work by Samuel Beckett, Albert Camus, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Allen Ginsberg, Eugène Ionesco, Jack Kerouac, John Ratchey, and Jean-Paul Sartre in its first 5 issues. Now, for Grove, Evergreen had 2 significant functions. First of all, it was a sort of literary test tube. It was a way of seeing whether people who read the magazine took to certain authors and then perhaps publishing them. It was also a way to draw in new authors, as obviously what they published would draw in people who wrote similar things. It was also from the start very much a quality magazine. It sold for a competitive price of $1, which was an indication that Grove was intended as, quote, stuff for universities, unquote, as Olympia Press's Maurice Girodias later remarked. But its production standards were much higher than the average literary magazine The Age, equal to was often called the quality paperback at the time, which yielded a longer shelf life. Its sales figures were also much higher, as I pointed out before, running into the tens of thousands. By the end of the 60s, it would be running into 200,000 copies per issue, which is really a lot for a magazine which contains literature. But you can also sort of notice that from the very start, Evergreen could draw on the sort of symbolic capital, to use a term by Pierre Bourdieu, accumulated by Grove Press, because its first issue, for instance, already contained work by Camus and Sartre, who by that time were sort of established authors and for which high fees had to be paid. And Grove could actually do that from the very start. So to return to the Beats, from the very start, obviously, the Beats had, to an extent, depended on little magazines to actually disseminate their work. A medium of which there was no shortage due to the mimeograph revolution. Just looking at the late 50s and early 1960s, magazines like Black Mountain Review, Semina, Jugend, The Floating Bear published many of the Beat writers, as did ephemeral publications like Michael McClure's Arc 2 Moby 1. But all these were hardly commercial ventures like Evergreen Review. So how did Evergreen end up devoting an entire issue of the magazine to these new writers? The answer, of course, lies in Evergreen's editor, Donald Allen. And as often the case, geography also played a key role. As Allen later recalled, it was his aversion to the sweltering New York summers which led him to spend those months in San Francisco. And in the summer of 1957, he put together an issue which, quote, focused on a vigorous new generation of writers, painters, and musicians in the Bay Area, which is revolting against the stability of the American academicians. Tough word. In this sense, the choice for the Beat simply also fit well within Ross's ambition to present an alternative to the university-based magazines. But by the summer of 1957, the Beat's popularity was also clearly on the rise, and none was called upon it more to describe and defend the movement than its doyen, Kenneth Rexroth. When Barney Rossett approached Rexroth to write an introduction to the issue, the author replied, "Oh no, not you too. I have written about the San Francisco Renaissance until I am black in the face." And in fact, Rexroth would write similar introductions to the movement that summer for instance, The Nation, New World Writing, and New Directions in Prose and Poetry. They've been collected in an essay collection, by the way. But what united these poets, critics, and artists included in the issue? You can sort of see what's, if you want to take a look there. And I'll quote Rexroth again. What he said in the introductory note, it was mostly disaffiliation, according to him. He said that no literature of the past 200 years is of the slightest importance unless it is disaffiliated. Our modern industrial and commercial civilization has produced an elite which has consistently rejected all the reigning values of society. There were no Baudelaires in Babylon. Sounds good. And while the issue contained a number of misses, Josephine Miles felt that the conclusion was a mistake because she felt she was more of a Beat scholar, an early Beat scholar, and actually a Beat poet. There was a very long essay by Doré Ashton about San Francisco art, which really not connected to the Beat generation at all. In particular, the inclusion actually of Ginsberg's howl was a major scoop, even if it appeared in a censored version. Some of the words are blotted out, and the footnote howl at the end was left out because that was apparently the most controversial bit. With the San Francisco court case on Howl still ongoing while the issue was in preparation, once it was out, Evergreen was obviously sure to be caught up in the general hullabaloo that surrounded Ginsberg's poem. So as a precaution, Rossett asked his lawyer for advice, who returned the following warning, which I think is great. Quote, do not print anything else in the issue that might be found objectionable, and don't let Ginsberg fill in the blanks. The blanks are, you should take a look at it. I'm not going to discuss. The blanks are really weird, by the way. Some of the words are blotted out, which I don't think are too offensive. And then, for instance, the bit about being fucked up the ass is not blanked out, which is really, I don't know who did the blanks, but it's really strange. But apparently they weren't sued for it. So, in the end, as Michael McClure later observed, the issue was a kind of reprise of the Six Gallery reading. With the exception of Philip Lamantia, all of the poets who read it at the event contributed to the Evergreen issue, and like at Six Gallery, they were introduced by Rexroth. So Evergreen number 2, you could argue, was a way to distribute what had been a local event to a nationwide audience. You could also say that for the Beats, Grove's established infrastructure as a growing publisher with a large new magazine was also simply too tantalizing an opportunity to disseminate their work to a nationwide audience. Well, it is sort of hard to measure the success of a single magazine issue. Several factors suggest that the San Francisco scene Evergreen was essential in promoting not just the San Francisco Renaissance writers, but the Beat generation on the whole. For one, the issue sold extremely well. It sold more than 23,000 copies by 1960, by which date there are still demand for the issue, which is 3 years after its release, which is really a long time. Furthermore, whereas obviously these people's careers have taken very different directions, actually all of them are still relatively well known today, which sort of shows that the magazine might have added in their canonization. And obviously this canonization was also further cemented by the 1960 collection in New American Poetry, which has been mentioned a bunch of times, which is also edited by Donald Allen, which he really explicitly saw as a sort of enlargement and expansion of this particular issue. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Evergreen circulation would rise steadily. It grew from 10,000 as a quarterly in 1957 to 25,000 as a bi-monthly in 1963. When number 32 came out in early 1964, Grove redesigned the magazine as a glossy, larger format to raise advertising revenue and improve newsstand sales. Actually, Dick Ellis, it's fortunate that he's no longer here today, but he wrote extensively about that. Well, the later Evergreen is in many ways a different kind of animal. It is much more concerned with political and social issues than literature. I'm not going to discuss it today. It's really, if you see both magazines next to each other, except for the name, it's impossible to imagine that they're the same magazine. The question remains, however, how well the Beats were represented in the Evergreen review issues after the San Francisco scene and before the format change. It's often been argued that when Donald Allen quit as an Evergreen editor with number 9, the magazine lost its innovation. While undoubtedly changed, in the case of the Beats, its interest in the movement actually only gradually waned. One reason for that is, for instance, that while Allen officially quit, he still advised Rossett all the way through the 1960s from San Francisco on what to publish. So while he was no longer the masthead, that did not necessarily mean he didn't influence the magazine. I wanted to survey how well the Beats were represented in the first 31 issues of Evergreen, and I decided to do the scientific thing and make a graph for once. So here we go. What I did is I inventoried, and these are issues 1 to 31, running from 1957 to 1963. I wanted to look how much of the page percentage was devoted to the Beats. I should say that to decide whether someone was a Beat or not, I stuck to the New American Poetry and just added some of the more obvious prose writers, so Kerouac, Burroughs, etc. I should also say that so the green line is the percentage of pages per issue devoted to the Beats. You can see number 2, obviously there is very high. But since I also sort of figured that obviously the Beat contributions were often poetry, which takes fewer pages than prose. There were a lot of critical essays in Evergreen. It might be snowed under a little bit. So I also counted author presence, or the percentage of Beat authors per issue, which is an ochre line. You can see that consistently it is somewhat higher. I should also note that next in issue 2, issues 7, 13, and 21 were theme issues. So that explains why there is relatively few or no Beat writing in those issues. What the graph shows, at least, and it would be interesting to see this for the entire magazine, I didn't have the time to do this, is that while Evergreen's interest in the Beats certainly slowly faded, I mean, it is a sort of gradually going down the line. After the hype of 1957, it actually faded more slowly than has often been suggested. Since early 1961, it still spent about a third of the issue on Beat writings, which is quite a lot, I would say. One thing I also wanted to look at is the personal relationships between the Beats and the Evergreen Review editors. Some Beat writers like Ginsberg and Corso would remain loyal to the magazine throughout the 1960s. Rossett would build a close relationship with both poets. I have wonderful holiday cards sent by Corso and Ginsberg from Venice to Rossett. They're amazing, and you really see that they have a very close relationship. Rossett was very lenient on fees for advances for work while they traveled in Europe, for instance. But other people, other Beat writers, quickly lost faith. And I want to show one example of that. Another example is Gary Snyder, for instance, who remarked in a letter to Donald Allen in 1960 that he felt that by now the Evergreens were getting a little too predictable, re-authors the material. But Robert Duncan is even more dismissive. When asked whether Evergreen could print his poem beginning with a line by Pindar, Duncan agreed, but he ensured that the Evergreen editor involved knew that this did not translate into any form of endorsement of the magazine. In larger part again. As Duncan wrote, the prospect then of a poem beginning with a line by Pindar being published by Evergreen Review is a business proposition, since there is no happy prospect for me in this transaction other than the payment received. He wanted to make that very, very clear. So I want to turn to my conclusions now. Looking at the existing literature on Evergreen Review and its role in 1950s and 1960s culture, it seems to revolve around a single question. Was Evergreen Review a trendsetter? Was it a magazine which sought out new, innovative literature and presented it to a wider audience? Or was it perhaps more of a cultural parasite which cashed in on other people's work, obviously things that have been published in smaller magazines than published in Evergreen, and used these authors in a way? So as one critic has said, was Evergreen an explorative or an exploitative magazine? Of course, as always, the reality is actually much more complex. Well, there's no denying that by the end of the 1960s, at least where literature was concerned, Evergreen lost touch with the times. I feel that this later phase has tended to eclipse the value of the earlier issues in critical discussion. Also, while Evergreen espoused the look of the traditional little magazine, perhaps best attested, as I've said before, by the use of the word review, it is unfair to equate it with the smaller magazines of the age. Financially backed by Rossett and embedded in Grove's cultural infrastructure, Evergreen was simply spared many of the hardships a lot of you will know about, suffered by smaller literary magazines, which obviously don't live 50 years normally. So in that sense, the magazine perhaps transmitted a confusing image of itself, attempting to be something it never was from the very start. Still, the Beats clearly benefited from their relation with Evergreen. For writers like Ginsberg and Corso, Rossett functioned as a kind of Maecenas figure, a doyen who not only financially supported part of their travels, but also was able to distribute their work both nationally and internationally. For them, Evergreen simply appeared at the right moment, since most of the university magazines would simply not take their work. From a periodical studies perspective, which is a field I work in, it also seems that further study is needed of the way Evergreen and other larger magazines took an interest in the Beats. For example, one example is New Directions in Prose and Poetry, which also did a lot to publish Beat writers. And like Rossett, James Laughlin at New Direction functioned as a Maecenas figure for younger authors. So while the role of the smaller Mimeograph Revolution magazines has seen extensive study, I think that magazines like Evergreen and New Directions in Prose and Poetry actually do deserve some sort of credit as conservative pioneers. As far not as daring as the little magazines were, which were mostly distributed among peers, Evergreen Review brought the Beats a university audience, and in doing so, it sowed the seeds of a new youth culture.